The price of a man's failure was his daughter. She was just 17, a currency of flesh and bone used to settle a debt, sold to a stranger who called himself a rancher. But in the desolate quiet of the plains, truth was a currency far more dangerous and valuable than coin, and the man who bought her was not what he seemed at all. Before we delve into this difficult journey, we'd love to know where you're watching from in the comments below. And if stories that challenge the heart and mind are what you seek, consider subscribing for more. The air in the small, dusty office was thick with the scent of stale sweat and defeat. It clung to the wooden walls, to the worn leather of the single chair, and to the stooped shoulders of her father. Ilara stood by the door, her presence a silent, searing accusation he refused to acknowledge. He would not look at her. His gaze was fixed on the ink-stained blotter on the desk, as if the secrets of the universe were trapped in its faded patterns. The man across from him, the one who called himself a rancher, was a silhouette against the harsh afternoon light pouring through the grimy window. He was a shape of a man, broad and still, his face lost in shadow. He didn't need a face. He was not a person. He was a consequence. He was the end of a road her father had walked alone. The only sound was the scratching of a pen, a dry, insectile noise that scraped against Ilara's nerves. A single sheet of paper, stark and white, lay between them. It was a bill of sale, a deed. For her. The scratching stopped. The silence that followed was louder, heavier. "It's done." The rancher's voice was low and gravelly, like stones shifting at the bottom of a dry well. It was not cruel, not kind. It was simply a statement of fact, as indifferent as the relentless sun outside. Her father finally moved, a slow, pained motion as he pushed the paper across the desk. His hand trembled. He was a good man, she thought with a sudden venomous clarity. A good man who had loved her with songs and stories, who had promised to build a wall against the world's evils. The wall had crumbled. He had crumbled. And now he was using the rubble to pay his dues. He had sold her. Just like that. She felt the words like a brand on her soul, a hot, sharp pain that stole her breath. Numbness was a mercy, a cool tide rising to quench the fire of her rage, but it couldn't reach the cold, hard stone of betrayal solidifying in her heart. The journey was a study in silence. It stretched between them, taut and humming, more oppressive than the vast empty sky above. The wagon creaked, a rhythmic, mournful sound that became the metronome of Ilara's new reality. Each groan of the axle was a tick of a clock, measuring the distance from everything she had ever known. She sat on the hard wooden bench, her hands clenched in her lap, her spine a rigid line of defiance. She refused to let her gaze drift to the man beside her, the man who now owned the paper that defined her existence. Instead, she watched the landscape bleed by. It was a harsh, unforgiving world of cracked earth and skeletal brush, the color bleached out by a sun that offered light but no warmth. It was a reflection of the emptiness blooming inside her. Silas, he had said his name was once. Just the one time. He handled the reins with an economy of motion, his large, calloused hands gentle on the leather. He was a contradiction. His stillness was immense, a mountain of a man, yet his eyes, when she dared to sneak a glance, were constantly moving, scanning the horizon with a watchfulness that felt predatory. What did he see? What was he looking for? She was a thing to him, a purchase. Yet he had placed a worn but clean blanket on her side of the bench before they'd left, a silent gesture that confused her. Was it a kindness? Or was it merely the act of a man protecting his investment? A memory, sharp and unwelcome, pierced through the monotonous dread. It was her and her father years ago mending a fence under a softer, gentler sun. He was telling her a story, his voice a warm rumble, about how the land gives back what you put into it. "You tend it with love, Ilara Bell," he'd said, his smile crinkling the corners of his eyes, "and it'll feed you forever." He had stopped tending to things with love a long time ago. He had put desperation and secrets into the soil of their lives. And this silent journey, this man beside her, was the bitter harvest. The memory soured, curdling into the landscape of her present misery, a ghost of a promise in a land of broken things. They arrived as dusk began to bleed purple and orange across the horizon, staining the edges of the bruised sky. The ranch was not what her mind had conjured. Her fear had painted a picture of squalor and noise, a chaotic yard filled with the stench of cattle and the shouts of cruel men. This was something else entirely. It was an island of order in an ocean of wild, untamed land. A single solid-looking house stood against the endless expanse, flanked by a sturdy barn, and a series of immaculately maintained fences that enclosed nothing. There were no cattle, no horses in the visible corral, no life at all save for the wind whispering through the tall, dry grass. The place felt less like a ranch and more like a fortress, a hermitage built for a man who wanted to keep the world at a great distance. It was stark, clean, and profoundly lonely. The silence here was different from the silence in the wagon. It was deeper, more absolute. Silas brought the wagon to a halt, and for a long moment simply sat, surveying his domain. Elara followed his gaze, and her fear, a hot and frantic thing, began to cool into a slow, creeping confusion. This wasn't the den of a brute. It was the sanctuary of a hermit. He finally dismounted and came around to her side. He did not offer a hand, but he waited for her to climb down, his presence a heavy, silent weight. He led her towards the house. The door opened into a large, simple room, dominated by a stone fireplace and furnished with sparse, handmade wooden furniture. Everything was clean, scrupulously so. It was the kind of clean that spoke of routine and discipline, not comfort. "Your room," he said, his voice startlingly loud in the stillness. He gestured to a doorway. She walked towards it, her legs stiff, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She expected a cot in a storage room, a pallet on a dirt floor. She found a small, neat room containing a simple bed with a folded quilt, a small table, and a single window that looked out onto the vast, empty plains. And on the door, she noticed with a jolt that twisted her insides, there was a latch, a simple, iron latch. On the inside, there was no lock on the outside. The first day unfolded in a haze of tense observation. The sun rose, casting long, distorted shadows that crept across the floorboards like spies. Elara woke with the disorienting feeling of being unmoored. A ship drifted into a strange and silent port. The house was quiet, but she could feel his presence, a steady, rhythmic energy that permeated the stillness. She found him in the yard, mending a harness with focused, methodical movements. He did not acknowledge her at first, his attention entirely consumed by the task. When he finally looked up, his eyes were clear and direct, holding no malice, but no warmth either. They were the eyes of a man who measured the world in practicalities. "There is water to be fetched from the well," he stated, not commanded. "The chickens need feeding." He gestured toward a small, well-protected coop she hadn't noticed the night before. And that was it. No list of arduous tasks, no threats, no mention of her status. He treated her not like a slave, nor even a servant, but like an inconvenient houseguest whose presence was tolerated but not desired. She did the chores, her movements stiff and awkward. The work was simple, but her mind was a whirlwind. Every action was a question. Why this charade? Why the pretense of normalcy? As she worked, she watched him. He moved with a purpose that was almost unnerving, from mending the harness to reinforcing a section of fence, to tending a small, hidden vegetable garden behind the barn. He worked with the relentless, untiring energy of a man at war with entropy itself. As the sun beat down, a more detailed memory of her father's fall from grace surfaced, unbidden. It wasn't one single event, but a slow erosion. The year the rains never came, and the crops withered to dust. The whispers she overheard about a bad investment, a man from the city with a slick smile and emptier promises. She remembered the arguments with her mother, hushed and frantic behind a closed door. And then, after her mother was gone, the heavy, suffocating silence that filled the house. Her father's hope had dried up long before the well ever did. He had sought a different kind of water, a different kind of salvation from men who dealt in ruin, and the price had been too high. Silas was just the collector. A week passed, measured not in days but in the silent meals they shared at opposite ends of the long wooden table. The tension was a living thing in the room, a third presence that ate with them, slept with them. Then came the test. Elara knew it was a test the moment she saw it. She had been sweeping the main room, the rhythmic whisk of the broom a small familiar comfort in the overwhelming strangeness. On the mantelpiece, propped against a worn leather-bound book, was a small deerskin pouch. It was unlaced, and the glint of coins from within was unmistakable. Silas had left for the barn an hour earlier, his footsteps fading into the vast quiet. He had never left money out before. Everything of value was always secured, a habit she'd noted with the detached interest of a prisoner studying her jailer. This was deliberate. A trap. A question asked without words. Her heart hammered against her ribs. The coins represented a chance, freedom. She could take it, slip out while he was gone, and run. But where would she run to? The plains were a death sentence for the unprepared, and she was woefully unprepared. To the nearest town, a young black girl alone with a pouch of unexplained money, she would be caught, questioned. She would be worse off than she was here. Here, at least, there was a strange, predictable safety. She was fed. She had a room with a latch on the inside. She was not beaten or violated. She was simply held. The conflict inside her was a bitter, churning thing. It wasn't a battle of honor versus theft. It was a cold calculation of risk, an equation of survival. With a trembling hand, she reached out and pushed the pouch back, nudging it so the coins were no longer visible. A small act of defiance, a refusal to play the game. She finished her sweeping, her hands shaking slightly. When Silas returned for the midday meal, he glanced at the mantelpiece. His eyes, for a fraction of a second, met hers across the room. He said nothing. He never mentioned the pouch, never acknowledged the test he had laid for her. But she knew that he knew, and something in the air between them shifted. A microscopic change in pressure, the first sign of a change in the weather. The silence between them began to change its texture. It was no longer a wall of suspicion, but a space that could, on occasion, hold something other than dread. An unspoken language began to form in the spaces between their sparse words. One afternoon, she found a book on her bedside table, the same leather-bound one from the mantelpiece. It was a collection of poems, its pages softened with use. There was no explanation, no note. It was simply there, an offering. She read it at night, the words a strange and beautiful counterpoint to the stark reality of her days. She began to notice other things, too. The way he would leave a small bowl of water near the barn for a stray cat with a torn ear. The meticulous care he took of the small vegetable garden, a patch of defiant green in a world of brown. One morning, she saw him tending to a hawk with a broken wing, his large, rough hands moving with an impossible gentleness as he splinted the delicate bone. These were the actions of a nurturer, not a captor. They were small cracks in the granite facade he presented to the world, and through them, she began to see a different man. The image of the man who bought her was beginning to fray at the edges, replaced by something far more complex and confusing. This growing dissonance forced her to look inward, to the source of her own pain. A memory of her mother, sharp and clear as glass, rose to the surface. Her mother, weak and fading in her bed, her hand in her father's. "Promise me," her mother's voice was a dry whisper, a rustle of leaves. "Promise me you'll protect her. Always." Her father had wept, his shoulders shaking as he made the vow. "Always, my love. I'll never let anything happen to her." The memory was a fresh wound, a profound and staggering betrayal that eclipsed everything else. The man in the ground who had made that promise was the one who had broken it. The man before her now, this silent, watchful stranger, was the one who gave her a book of poems and mended a bird's broken wing. The world was upside down. Her anger, once a diffuse fog of misery, now had a target. It was not for the man who had bought her, but for the one who had sold her. The arrival of the horseman shattered the fragile quiet of their routine. He was a small, nervous man who rode a jittery mare, and he looked at the ranch as if he expected it to swallow him whole. He dismounted before he even reached the house, his eyes darting around as if searching for threats in the empty landscape. Silas met him in the yard, his body language shifting instantly. He became larger, more imposing, a shield between the stranger and the house, a shield between the stranger and her. Alara watched from the kitchen window, her hands submerged in a basin of soapy water. She could not hear their words, only the low, tense murmur of their voices. The stranger gestured wildly, his panic palpable even from a distance. Silas remained still, a rock against which the other man's anxiety crashed and broke. She saw the stranger pass Silas a heavy coin purse, a gesture of payment, or perhaps tribute. Then, as the man prepared to leave, A gust of wind carried a fragment of their conversation to her, snatching words from the air and delivering them like a thrown stone. Network is compromised. The stranger's voice was thin and reedy with fear. Safe passage for the next one. Silas's reply was a low rumble, inaudible. The words hung in the air, electric and terrifying. Network. Safe passage. The next one. These were not the words of a rancher. They were the language of secrets, of fugitives, of something hidden and dangerous. The world tilted on its axis, the simple, harsh reality she had come to accept dissolving into 1,000 questions. The ranch wasn't a ranch. The isolation wasn't for solitude. It was for concealment. The stranger finally spurred his horse and fled, disappearing back into the shimmering heat haze from which he had emerged. Silas stood alone in the yard for a long time before turning back to the house. When he entered, the silence was back, but now it was filled with a new, sharp-edged dread. She dried her hands, her heart pounding a frantic, desperate rhythm. She had to know. Turning from the sink, she faced him, her voice a tremor she could not control. Who was that? What safe passage? Silas looked at her, and for the first time she saw something flicker in his stony expression. It wasn't anger or annoyance. It was weariness. A deep, bone-weary exhaustion, as if he had been holding up a great weight for a very long time. He walked past her to the fireplace, leaning an arm against the cool stone of the mantel. He stared into the empty hearth as if the answers were written in the soot and ash. The silence stretched, and in it, Elara felt her fear sharpening into a desperate, ragged courage. She would not be silent any longer. She would not be a passive object in her own life. He had underestimated her. Everyone had. He finally turned his head, his gaze not quite meeting hers. "Your father's debt," he began, his voice low and measured, each word carefully placed. "It wasn't to me." The statement landed with the force of a physical blow, knocking the air from her lungs. He got himself tangled with men who don't just break your legs when you can't pay. They take things that can be sold for a much higher price. They trade in people, Elara. The way he said her name for the first time with something other than formal distance sent a shiver down her spine. They had their eyes on you. The debt was just their excuse. They were coming for you one way or another, to sell you south or west, to a life that would have been no life at all. He paused, letting the horror of it sink in. Your father, he was a fool. He was a broken man. But he loved you. In his own desperate, clumsy way, he loved you. The story tumbled out, stark and unbelievable. Her father, realizing the true nature of the trap he was in, had sought out the only person he knew who stood against men like that. He had come to Silas. The sale, the signed paper, the exchange of coin, it was all a performance. A carefully staged play to convince the traffickers that their debt had been collected by a lone, hard man who would not be challenged. The money her father gave Silas wasn't a payment for her soul. It was a pittance to fund the next rescue. This ranch wasn't a prison, it was a safe house. A station on an underground railroad for people fleeing a new kind of slavery. Silas was no rancher. He was a conductor. The truth did not set her free. It shattered her. The foundations of her reality, built on the simple, solid bedrock of betrayal, crumbled into dust, leaving her suspended in a terrifying void. Every certainty she had clung to, her father's weakness, Silas's cruelty, her own status as a victim, was a lie. Or rather, a truth so twisted and complicated that it resembled a lie. The man she had hated for selling her had, in fact, been trying to save her, in the only desperate, convoluted way his broken mind could conceive. The man she had feared as her captor was her protector, a silent guardian standing against a darkness she never even knew existed. A storm of emotion broke inside her, a hurricane of grief, relief, and a rage so profound it left her breathless. Grief for the father who had to orchestrate the loss of his own daughter to save her life. Relief that the unspeakable horrors she had imagined were not her fate. And a white-hot rage at a world so cruel and unjust that it could force a father into such an impossible, monstrous choice. She sank into a chair at the table, the one she had always sat at, the one at the opposite end from him. She buried her face in her hands, and for the first time since she'd arrived, she wept. Not silent, resentful tears, but ragged, soul-tearing sobs that shook her entire body. Silas did not move to comfort her. He gave her the dignity of her grief, letting the storm pass. When the sobs finally subsided into shuddering breaths, he spoke again, his voice quiet but clear. "The men your father was involved with, they believe you are with me. For now you are safe here, but this is not a life, it is a waiting room." He came to the table and sat down, not at his end, but in the chair next to hers. He placed the deed on the table between them, the hateful paper that had defined her. Then he slid a small, sharp knife next to it. "You can stay," he said. "You can help. Or when the time is right, I can get you north, to a new place, a new name, a real life. Or you can take your chances now. The choice is yours. It has always been yours, you just didn't know it." Elara stared at the paper on the table. It was just a piece of paper. The ink was her father's, the words of fiction that had saved her life. It was a symbol of her bondage, and now, a symbol of her father's desperate, heartbreaking love. It was everything all at once. Her hand trembled as she reached out, not for the knife, but for the paper. She picked it up, the flimsy sheet feeling impossibly heavy. She looked across at Silas, truly seeing him for the first time. The hard lines of his face were still there, but they no longer looked like cruelty. They looked like resolve. The weariness in his eyes was the cost of his convictions. He was not a monster or a saint. He was just a man who had drawn a line in the sand and dared the world to cross it. The vast empty landscape she had seen as a prison now looked different through the window. The endless horizon was no longer a wall, but an offering, a possibility. She thought of the book of poems, the mended hawk's wing, the latch on the inside of her door. They were all pieces of a truth she had been too blind with her own pain to see. She had a choice, a real one. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, her future was not a predetermined path of servitude, but an open question. She could run, or she could stay. She could be a fugitive, or she could become a part of this strange, silent war. She took a deep breath, the air filling her lungs feeling clean and new. She met Silas's steady gaze, and for the first time, an understanding passed between them, as clear and strong as a spoken vow. She did not need to say the words. He already knew her answer. Slowly, deliberately, she ripped the paper in two, then in four, letting the pieces fall from her hand onto the table. The debt was settled. A new one of gratitude and shared purpose, was just beginning. The future was still a vast unknown territory, but for the first time she felt ready to face it. It was hers.